This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, we're at the last panel of a long and interesting, engaging discussion today. And one of my adaptations is that I'm not going to present the paper I wrote for this workshop. I'll post it on the website. And instead, I'll give a presentation that's parallel to it with lots of visuals. And I'll try to keep it brief. But I'm interested in explaining institutional change that gives rise to the emergence of economic institutions. And this is important because it's the economic institutions that enable, motivate, and guide economic activity. And in the case that I'm addressing, robust economic growth. And so this is an attempt to provide an account that brings to the center of the causal explanation mechanisms that are very familiar to all of us, that are universal, that are built into social relationships, into networks. And so I'm also aware that there's sensational possibilities in the emergence of online communities and accessibility of big data through the internet, and that things will be done and possibilities will be explored that we are just beginning to realize. So I agree with Duncan and with Barnaby about this. But many of the most pressing questions, the most important questions that we need to address, and we do address in the social sciences, are in the world we live in, not taking place necessarily in Twitter or on the internet, but in the world that we live in, where the consequences are very different from the consequences of an online dating community. So that then is what I want to address, the aspect of how do we engage in explaining the emergence and of new institutions, given the challenges of studying something as complicated as, say, the rise of capitalism in China. Again, this is of great interest to all of us because here you have a centrally planned economy that in a relatively short period of time shifted away from central planning to develop the second largest economy in the world. And the most dynamic part of that economy is classic capitalism, for-profit capitalism. And how does one explain this? Because if you take the point of view of state-centered theory, you explain it by looking at what politicians do. But the problem here is the politicians, the Chinese elite, did not want capitalism and threw up all sorts of barriers that they could think of to block it. What they wanted was to restore socialism through some little bit more reliance on the market mechanism, but stop it there. It's very difficult for economists to explain because people like Doug North focus on property rights and focus on the formal rules. And the formal rules don't really fit at the start of the rise of capitalism, what you need for capitalism. No, property rights were weak. The legal system was arbitrarily enforced, unpredictable. All the things that you needed, according to Doug North, to sustain rapid economic growth was not there. And still mostly is not there. So what we did was to take a field laboratory. I'm not a China expert, but I sense there's a great opportunity to figure out what's going on, to explain what's going on in a major place like China, because it's close enough to the origin, close enough to the Big Bang, that you can collect data. And to collect data in a serious way that involves an integrated research program of mixed methods, to bring to bear all the methods that we have developed in the social sciences since the time of Karl Marx and Max Weber to see how we can use a mix of methods and integrated research design to extract what is extremely difficult from a country as difficult to study as China because of the aspect of the political order. And so in this Yangtze Delta region, and you can see the center of the market economy is the coastal area. And this is the epicenter where you have the emergence of a domestic form of classical capitalism. Alibaba is just one of many firms with similar growth trajectories in one of the cities that we studied. In fact, we wrote about it. So it's not that uncommon. And these are not state-owned enterprises, but private firms launched in the classic entrepreneurial way. And so what we've done here is to build over a decade, in almost a decade, a field lab where we are using a whole set of tools, survey research, face-to-face interviews, lab in the field where we are using experiments that have been developed in the lab in the university by Kevin McCabe and others. That's where I got the idea from the previous workshop. And we are also using network structure analysis that developed by Ron Burt. But we have had 3 large-scale surveys involving probably one of the largest sample of CEOs of firms, randomly selected, 700 of them in 7 different cities in this area. It's a random sample that has become a network in the sense that we go back to them every 3 years. And the last survey was 2012, and we had 75% retention from the original one, 2006. So we're following these entrepreneurs who are building the second largest capitalist economy in the world, and some say it's soon to surpass the size of ours. I have to wait to see that. But the key is that we're using a mix of methods to try to extract from it an explanation that is convincing against the best rival explanation against the best history, against a history of research on the question. So it involves a really very major effort. It involves a team of economists at Lund University that Sonja Opper leads, a group of us at Cornell University involving graduate students and postdocs in the past. And what we are finding is that if it isn't the politicians in the state and the Communist Party, what is it that explains for the rise of economic institutions that enable and motivate and guide this capitalist economic development? And we have done multiple measures of networks, both in a qualitative sense and now in a quantitative sense, to examine what types of, what is involved in the creation of a dynamic regional growth pattern clustered and centered in this Yangtze Delta area. And it turns out that much of the economic activity, the exchange of resources, of information, the creation of a common identity, of a common sense of sentiment, takes place within networks. And we track it, we measure it, we look at the importance of networks. It's for suppliers, for all the different key areas of economic activity. And so we have multiple measures of this. And the question is then, given the weak property rights, how are they able to build economic institutions that provide durable contracts where litigation is unreliable, and even if you won in the court, they don't have the enforcement mechanism for people to pay on losses. And so it turns out that so much of it is tied to personalized exchange, private order, that rely on community sanctions, on multiplex relations that have to do with shared identity and cooperation, but very much on reputation, that people talk and the talk gets around, and they talk, and your reputation is your main source of capital, and that they're very cognizant, aware of. And you can see in these quotes from face-to-face interviews with the CEO, whoever dares do something bad, everyone will know about it, everyone will stop giving credit, and there will be no hope of making it in this business. Reputation is the code of conduct. Good reputation is needed. If you want to help others, you have to help. You have to have a good reputation. Well, there's just quite a lot of this type of fine-grained accounts that gives you a sense of just how it is that they went about building their own capital markets, their own labor markets, their own supplier and distribution chain, all the things that they were denied by a state that tried to keep this out of the mainstream economy, which they built. And so this is an account where it was networks and the norms that created the foundation for the economic institutions. So in this effort was the quest for a theory of institutional change, in this case, endogenous institutional change, because it's not coming necessarily from the state, how in the sense of the emergence of economic institutions. So we use the Schelling model to model the dynamics of this, the social dynamics of the bottom-up emergence of economic institutions that relied on a series of tipping points. A collective action is very important that leads to a social movement-like dynamic that becomes self-reinforcing. As the economy grows, it becomes more profitable and more people come in. And the state is brought back in when it can't be stopped, when it suddenly becomes an important source of tax revenue. And it's not until 2007, 20 years after the capitalist economy began, that the state put in property right law that provided secure property rights, long after the fact. So it was ex post rather than, as the new institutional economics would argue, you need this condition in place so that you can have economic growth. Okay. So China is really different, and some people would say really weird, and different from us at least. And so the question is, were the mechanisms that we had identified and confirmed empirically in China special to China, special to something that evolved out of the Ming Dynasty? And therefore we are context bound, hopelessly bound by history, culture, and place. So in the sequel study, the question is to find the place as far away in terms of institutional quality and environment from the Yangtze Delta region. And that was New York City, where you have good, inclusive political, economic institutions, property rights that are so well established long ago that it fosters the best economic, financial markets in the world next to London. And so what gained my attention initially was, I was interested in the Cornell Tech campus. And I suddenly realized, it's not the tech campus, because that's not even going to be complete until 2030. But the key was that out of nowhere, suddenly New York City became the second largest tech-enabled economy in the world, in the United States. And growing faster than Silicon Valley. And it takes place in an odd time, around 2008, just about the time when the Great Recession started. So what is going on here? So we take the same research design, mixed methods, integrated research design, and we are then focusing on a very different historical institutional context, Lower Manhattan. I think NYU is around here. It's taking place around NYU. And so what explains this robust emergence? You could say Mayor Bloomberg, he's an entrepreneur, and he recognized that New York was too dependent on financial services, and he was a cheerleader. You could say that it was an exogenous shock. A lot of financial service workers lost their jobs, but they had money and they were young and wanted to start up firms. You could say that it was time for this to happen because apps became important, the hardware less important, and so you could use the apps to link to existing businesses to improve productivity. All that's important, but the key here is that Silicon Valley has in place all the key infrastructure. Great research university, lots of engineers, lawyers, established industrial labs, headhunters, lawyers, and all the things that were in place. But in New York, this was not in place. It was there for financial services, but not for startup, knowledge-based economic activity. Where did this come from? And so this is the question: where did the economic institutions come from? And what we saw, I did over 50 or so interviews tracking around Lower Manhattan, going into these startup shops and interviewing people. This was the preparation to build the quantitative survey instrument. And this is a very typical comment. Again, norms of cooperation. I expect a colleague that I talk to, even at a competitive firm, to give me sound advice on getting investors, launching a product, generating a product, just general business advice. Very common form of statement of norms of cooperation, self-help. You see, this is a very common type of startup firm, but you can see that there are norms about restraint. Getting money from investors doesn't mean you go on a vacation and now you're wealthy. No, you're not going to get the most expensive furniture. You're not going to rent a really expensive office or hire 30 people. And again, these are very common forms of normative content statements that regulate the bottom-up emergence of key economic institutions. And here's a very central one, the New York Tech Meetup. This was started by Scott Heiferman in 2004, 4 people in his office. By 2014, when we met the people there, it was a membership of 41,000. They meet once a month on the NYU campus, the largest assembly. They have pitches for new startup firms. And so we were able to get, through their cooperation, data that tracks the emergence of this economic institution that plays a key role in driving economic activity, cooperation. And we are able to then follow the emergence at the point of origin with long data and big data. The data was made available to us, downloaded through the internet, online. So it's hybrid study, which involves the same set of methods we used in the Yangtze Delta, but then getting closer. And so this is work that I'm doing in collaboration with Dan De La Posta, who's back there. And we got a decade of record of all the people who ever attended New York Tech Meetup meetings on a monthly basis, about 169 meetings. And there were about 15,359 who attended. Then we got the emails that they sent to each other from 2007 to 2014. Then we got the interests that were listed by the members as to why they joined the New York Tech Meetup, their interest, and words that they provided in biographical sketches, and membership in other meetup groups. There are many other specialized meetup groups that they're joining. Link them all together. And we are at a fairly advanced stage of the analysis, but surely this is preliminary. We also have the email records, which were, last summer we coded qualitatively 5 very bright Cornell undergraduates working on that project. And then we're going to machine code it. So we have a complete set of the email codes, about 100,000 emails that were sent. And so you can see here interest. And this is linked to the frequency these words are used. They're interested in the tech economy, startup, looking for business opportunities, software, but basically network, job search, entrepreneurs, and information seeking defines this community. They call themselves technologists. And they have a clear identity, a clear sense of community, which involves a geographical concentration where people know each other and multiplex networks. And here you see a beginning of the analysis where these are interests that are linked to other people's interests. And we're using an algorithm developed by Mark Newman. And what you see here is a dense, tight network where people share common interest, because this is a network of interest, and that it's a cohesive structure of shared interest that include social activity, professional marketing, networking, sharing technology, information, startups, and so entrepreneurship ideas. And they even have someone listing Hillary Clinton's interest, but it's not linked to other interests, so it's not there. But there are 4 main clusters, and it's cohesive, and showing that that there are boundaries based on their common identity and interests as technologists. And so what we're doing is analyzing the community structure of this community, and that we're looking for the emergence of this economic institution, which played a key role in the rapid development and growth of the tech-enabled community. And so what we see and what we expect to see is that in the beginning, there were hacksters, 4 of them, and they were like-minded group of people, cohesive. But as the economic institution emerges, there is a process much like Durkheim's shift from mechanical to organic solidarity, a differentiation of special interests, of special skills, of human capital that forms an ecology with a differentiated division of labor. And we see it here in this link of email threads that they send to each other. And all the people who are linked to threads reflect different interests. And this is going year by year for all the people who attended the tech meetup and sent emails to each other and participate in thread. And you can see that there's a tendency of 2007 is the first year of moving towards increasingly more specialized communities, sub-communities based on shared interest and knowledge that gets involved in the email that people send to each other. Call for help, call for finding technologists, for lawyers, for venture capital. But you can see that as time moves on, the general process is towards greater differentiation, ecology.
What happened in 2012? It kind of reversed.
Right. Well, there was missing data for some of this period. So this is there were a couple months where the listserv broke down and they were not collecting data. But you can see this is a dynamic process of emergence from a undifferentiated mass of people who are like-minded to one of greater specialization and the ecology of knowledge and skills and interest. Now, here we use the Newman for identifying community structure. And here modularity is, we track the modularity over time for the people who are sending share email participation, the networks of email threads. And so begin with 2007, modularity is about 0.330, 3326. And then you see, so it stays relative, so then it begins to grow up to 0.51 and then 0.48. And so that tracks, what that is tracking is the increasing differentiation and specialization of interest in this net community of technologists, which now, rather just only hacksters, has venture capitalists, people looking for jobs, professionals, a whole group and differentiated set of interests that gets represented in the meetings that they convene once a month. So what we see here is evidence for a bottom-up emergence of economic institutions that does not involve top-down government initiative. We are, in the survey we're doing, we have completed the pretest. And in that pretest of 21 CEOs we've interviewed, only one report that they ever had any help from the municipal government. Most of the sample of 1,500 that we draw from, we can track to participation in the New York meetup, that they pitched their ideas there, they got their big breakthrough there with help from someone else, meeting venture capitalists. There's a sociology dropout from Princeton that I interviewed, and he went to the meetup after a lecture by Putnam at Princeton. Putnam was on the board of directors at the meetup, and he went there, got excited, dropped out of Princeton. Now he's the CEO. I met him when he was 23 of a very promising startup called Branch.com, which is linked in with Twitter and has a couple, $3-4 million backing him. So this is a social movement. There's a collective action that takes place you talk with these people, they said, in the beginning, my parents were really concerned. I think it was a good idea to drop out of Harvard Business School. And now the most sought after place to be in New York City is to be a startup entrepreneur setting up your firm. So that is where we end. But the quest is for universal mechanisms that explain general mechanisms, to be more modest, explain institutional change and emergence. The key difference between New York City and Shanghai and Yangtze Delta is that the Yangtze Delta, the norms and networks were in opposition to the state, and a lot of pressure had to be put against the state for a long time, 2 or 3 decades before you had the emergence of capitalism. In New York City, it took 3 or 4 years. Very quick, because it was a close fit between the formal institutions and the informal norms and networks, which did the heavy-duty work of the emergence of rapid economic growth in this key sector. Yes.
So, Victor, I think it's. I mean, first of all, the whole emergence of the tech scene in New York is totally fascinating, and of course, my lab is right in the guts of all of this, so we think about this a lot. But just with respect to Meetup, I think it's interesting that you are talking about the New York Tech Meetup as sort of the independent variable that's,
Oh, no, it's just one of them.
Well,
the one we have data on, yeah.
But because when I think of the New York Tech Meetup, I think that's the puzzle to be explained. Because if you go back to 2002, when Scott Heifernan founded Meetup, he wasn't thinking about tech at all, right? I mean, he was thinking, he was, but he was thinking about it a very different way. So the origin of Meetup, the company, was his sort of response to Putnam's critique that technology was alienating and isolating, and that once upon a time we used to sort of meet in physical environments and do things together, and now we just play video games and do social networks and stuff. And so Scott said, he sort of believed that was fundamentally wrong, and he wanted to prove it by creating this company. But when Meetup was created, the Tech Meetup was not. It was years away before that became a thing. It was just kind of all kinds of random stuff that people were meeting about. And in fact, the dominant mode, or the dominant group of people who used Meetup were moms. It was a mother's gathering network, because these are, and it made sense, right? It was unexpected, right? He didn't expect, that's not what he designed it for either. But it turns out, you have stay-at-home moms who who are sort of, they have spare time during the day and they're feeling isolated, and so they want to meet with other moms who are sharing the same kinds of experiences and have the same kinds of questions. And so it's sort of, that just sort of exploded, and then
Are they in your data set, the moms?
well, I mean, and then,
I think there are all sorts of. There was a huge group of people there for social meeting others and networking.
and it was lots and lots of. I mean, it tended to be smaller groups, right? Like, so it would be sort of half a dozen people getting together in a coffee shop. And so for years they kind of had that as their model. That there's sort of, and there was even sort of monetizing Meetup. The company was thinking, oh, we need to start doing deals with coffee shops and bars because we can like bring. No, I'm serious. This was what they were trying to do. They're like, oh, we can bring like 20 people to your bar during a slow period, and so you should like, we can get some compensation. So it's sort of interesting that this thing kind of grew out of all of that because it sort of looks very much like a convention now, and it's sort of become a very different sort of 40,000 people. I mean, this is sort of completely not what Meetup was created to do.
You're right. Meetup.com is a general app that allows people to call meetings through the internet and anybody joining. This is a pet project of Heiferman, the New York Tech Meetup. There are all sorts of dog walking meetups, genius meetups, alcoholics meetup, but there are all sorts of them. And so this one is for the technologists.
No, I understand what it is. I get the point I'm making is that this is also an interesting problem of emergence.
Right. The
This
innovation.
thing exists at all. Yeah. Forget about the larger problem of the New York tech scene, although it's related. Right. It's like, how the hell did this happen?
Right. It was a organizational innovation, new organizational form, as far as I can make of it, that linked an app that was very effective to use the internet to bring people together, and then put it to the technology, and the technologists needed a sense of town halls. There's a famous account of Scott Heiferman getting one of the early accounts of iPad, and he took it out in front of Meetup and smashed it. So we don't need it. We need to get together at this Meetup meeting. Sonja?
I think I'm not sure. I think you've been talking a little past each other. I think we both share this idea. How could this happen with this New York Tech Meetup? Because there's a parallel study to this that we're doing in Sweden. They're trying to mimic this. They think there should be a tech meetup. There is a tech, some region tech meetup. And this has been stagnating over years. And this is basically a group of 30 people, and they still meet in an Irish pub. And it is a substantial, even cross-country community. That's Copenhagen and Malmö and Lund University. This is a big region, and we have a lot of startup firms there. But the idea that they could organize by a tech meetup and even get together, it is completely bizarre for Swedish people. So I think
people said the same thing about Meetup for a long time as well.
Yeah,
like, who are these people? And I mean, when I was at Columbia, like some graduate student was going to go and do an ethnography of meetups because it just seemed such a weird thing. Like, who are these people who want to like get together and strangers get together in a bar and talk about like dogs or something? It just seems so crazy. And yet now it doesn't seem crazy at all. It seems like, well, of course they're doing this.
Yeah.
I see.
There is this additional layer to it.
I forgot to say that this is a comparative study. So the same research design and mixed methods approach will be used in New York City, in southern Sweden, and in Shanghai. And so the data has almost been completed, data collected for New York, and then I think Sweden's next. But all run out of Cornell.
Let me put
from
it
the
this
Cornell
way. We have
Survey
less
Research
to do with
Institute.
all these emails going back and forth.
Yes,
I'm curious about, just to probe a little further about the differences between them. You were very clear about differences in institutional structure, I understand.
sure, yeah.
But I meant differences in the networks themselves. Do you have you gotten far enough that you could see different topologies in the Chinese and this networks, or is that too early for you? Because your networks in China were not meetup type networks, so there were interviews and so forth. So I just elaborate on what you think the differences at the network level are, if any.
We have had 9 years head start, 10 years head start in Shanghai, so that's a much more developed field lab. This New York City is 2 years in progression, and so we will use the very similar research designed for measuring ecocentric networks. But the key breakthrough, I thought, was getting the network data from New York Tech Meetup that allows us to analyze over time the complete set of networks of all the people who ever attended the New York Tech Meetup. And most of the firms that we have in our sample, their CEOs went to the meetup either to pitch their company or they attend to exchange information. So we should be able to link the firm survey with the random sample with the meetup data of their interest and so forth. So it's an effort of linking together data to extract a deeper understanding of the process by which you shift from the Durkheimian process of from simple mass of interest and similar people to more complex division labor. Let's see, Francesca.
So I wanted to ask you more about the comparison because the emergence from the bottom up is very inspiring, and yet I sense, and I could be wrong, a certain tension in your story whereby sometimes the two situations are both, China is more working against the government, and New York is working in the absence of government, perhaps. But because you said a few times that these entrepreneurs never had direct help from the government, but without channeling, Elizabeth Warren, every business person in North America has had help for the government just because there are hospitals, streets, and everything. So in some ways, one thing is to have rules that are designed especially for an industry or a sector. One thing is just to have a larger infrastructure of property rights and physical infrastructure. So I wasn't quite sure.
Excellent point. It is not a story of either or government or bottom up. It's clearly both. Because Mary Bloomberg was very active in building the infrastructure and keeping the political and economic institution open access and inclusive, and rules of property rights very well defined. And he invested in infrastructure like some of the high-tech trade schools. The Economic Development Corporation put money in. It's simply that what made the difference for the dynamic social movement like rise of startup economy, that didn't, as it should have, didn't come Bloomberg's office. He's too good of a politician to want to propose something top down. But it came bottom up and was regulated by networks and norms of this tech community. So it is clearly a multi-level model. Sonja showed the model that we're using that involves the state, the organizational field, and then the networks of entrepreneurs. And so the focus for the emergence of the economic institutions that enabled this was not on the politicians, as you would do, say, in a North approach, but on the economic actors and the forms of cooperation they build through networks and norms that allow for this very incredible emergence of indirect reciprocity, generalized exchange, that enables very rapid growth.
So
Steve,
okay, can I just, because I like that, but then why does it have to be universal? Because it is context specific.
Well,
I mean, these differences that you just highlighted are not universal. I mean, it's hard to have a universal model with these specific specificities.
Very good. The quest is for universal mechanisms, general mechanisms, with very detailed, fine-grained accounts of the historical institutional context. So every explanation is different, but if you can say, gee, it's the same mechanisms that drive this, is a set of robust ones that are everyday occurrences that take place in every social exchange over time, then you're making some progress, it seems to me, from being simply left with context-bound, limited accounts. Steve?
There was an entity or a region called Silicon Alley.
Yes.
If you remember, in the late
Right,
1980s,
right.
90s, Duncan and I went to visit a company that was around 1998 that was calling itself 6degrees.com, which is now defunct.
Yeah.
But it would have been Facebook, except they were they were way too early. So, did Silicon Alley die, or did any of that filter into what became this thing?
Well, it's a good story because our the sample frame is all firms must be born in the 21st century. And so that allows us to go back to the early firms that were part of Silicon Alley. But there is some link, but the really period of explosive growth occurs around 2007, 2008, at the time of the beginning of the Great Recession. So the people who were involved in the earlier startups are now, in a way, lagging. They are not part of the networks that are driving the new startup firms.
Just, going back to the spatial thing, I don't remember. Duncan, do you remember Silicon Alley proper?
They were South Street Seaport.
Yeah, they were far down. Yeah.
So it's down lower left
It
corner.
was way down there.
So it's really shifted towards the mid.
Yes, it seems.
Union Square.
Uh-huh.
Mostly, I don't know if it totally died in the .com crash, but they were mostly like
Right.
extinguished.
Yeah, they were pre-2000, so they had a big extinction event then.
and then it sort of people thought, oh, it's interesting because there was an explicit attempt to make New York this tech center, and everyone thought it was going to happen, and it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And then everyone said, oh, I guess it's just finance, whatever. We'll just go back to doing that. And then it happened.
And then
It sort of without people really paying
But isn't it
attention.
natural? I mean, this is mentioned, the preconditions were, in fact, that there was a crash. I mean, it strikes me that one of the things that I would like to see you say more about is preconditions, not just political and so forth, but just a relevant number of a certain age group who are suddenly unemployed. Maybe they are. I was thinking about the whole issue of alienation, Putnam alienation. You interviewed specifically said this. I mean, to me, as a Midwesterner, New York is nothing but alienated people. But I'm joking. But maybe in China, because of the number of migrants. Yes, the huge mobility of the population also creates potentially alienated people. And these are the preconditions under which you would expect this kind of thing to take off.
But I think it's even more complicated, right? That if you look at the nature of the firms that have established themselves in New York, they're leveraging existing industries, right? So the tech that has sprouted up in New York is not like the tech that you see in Silicon Valley, right? If the pure tech companies are mostly still in Silicon Valley, it's like, tech in fashion, tech in media, tech in music, tech in finance, tech in medicine, tech in all the things that New York was already strong at. So there's sort of it's not like there was nothing here. There was all this other infrastructure, and when technology, when the tech industry sort of got to the point where it was sort of saying, oh, what else? What other industries can we go and colonize? New York was sort of the place to do that. Yeah.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.